Thank you. And so I think we've been obviously hearing about AI probably in every session that you've been part of, not only today, but over the last couple of months. In fact, I was doing a session somewhere else in the morning today, and the only conversation we had across 8 different speak sessions and speak tracks was just about AI. And I think it gets monotonous after a certain extent of time. So what I've done is I've tried to keep my 20 minutes essentially speaking about a balance between both sides of the world. Clearly, I'm not part of the marketing or the digital content creation part of it, and neither am I part of the platform or solutions like Soumya mentioned. She's got a wonderful tool, etc. We don't have any of that, but what I can clearly do is probably showcase what is happening in this space globally. And these are interesting times because essentially if you look at how content is being generated, and I wanted to put this disclaimer right up front that we haven't really been using AI or AI bots to make this presentation, and I'll tell you why this is important probably towards the end of my session. But what is important are these numbers that you see on screen, right? And as marketers, as brand owners, and people who actually make brands, it's important that you see that almost 73% of leading market tools, etc., are being, leaders today. And when I speak of leaders, I'm talking about CMOs, I'm talking about business owners, I'm talking of companies who own IPs out there are looking at having AI as part of the narrative. But at the same time, there are consumers who are probably very and obviously concerned about the consumption of the content that they're getting, right? And that's exactly the fine line that we need to balance. And that's what my talk track is going to be on. But these are numbers that we've got to be very, very mindful and careful of, because if you look at it, 68% of brands are actually exploring digital or AI as their core way of reaching out to customers. And almost 215 million pounds, and these are in British pounds, is when you have, in terms of the revenue, we are talking about upwards of 48 billion pounds that have been actually spent on creating narratives around AI just last year. And we're talking about 215 million people who are actually following this content. So that's a big, big number that you're actually speaking of. And as per one of the research that EY did, we've actually seen almost 70% of brand budgets being spent on AI-driven influencing over the next couple of years, right? Now, obviously, we've been consuming, we've been seeing, and we've been using AI on our daily lives, but then what really is important is to also understand what is the dark side of it. And I'm not going to be reading these slides, but these are things that have actually made an impression and an impact in each one of our lives, be it in terms of you looking at a bias of algorithms, really, I can go on with that. So the algorithms in terms of really manipulating what you see and what you sort of absorb, to the false narrative that AI has actually created. And probably the audience here is very, very, I would say is very, very native to what it is. But then there are a few people, probably the slightly more senior section of our community, or people who are not as social media friendly, if I may, who are being actually targeted on areas like these. We are also speaking of deepfake impersonation, and that's changed. I mean, gone are the days when you would have a really poor face implanted on somebody else's body. Now if you just go up your phone, and you just put in a video request on Grok, within 30 seconds you have such incredible videos. My dad was absolutely amazed to see me scale up Mount Everest, where I was probably sitting out of a restaurant in Bombay. So I think it's extremely important to understand how the use and misuse of this is happening. And that's where we as marketers and we as people who actually run brands and businesses got to be careful about. Because if you look at how deepfake deception is working, how fabricated engagement is, and how we're looking at false narratives, this is exactly the trust deficit that consumers are looking at when it comes to brands like you. And when I speak of trust deficit, I'm actually speaking of customers actually being wary about the fact that they're buying stuff from consumption of data that has been manipulated by an AI bot or from an AI engine. And that is, probably it was a long sentence, but then I'm sure you get what I'm trying to convey here is that you got to be mindful as brand owners and brand marketers about the content that you put up there and how authentic it is, because at the end of the day, it's a human on the other side. It's very clear when they understand the language, the nuances, the lingo, the cultural nuances, all of it, right? And this is what's happened. If you see, these are examples pretty much very close to home. So the Fashion Week one was obviously global, but if you see what happened with the beauty brand and the restaurant, these are stuff that has happened in India, and I can't obviously put out names, but these were massive breaches that happened just earlier this year. And these were only because of content that was put out there without a human element or a human intervention of actually going and checking the data that was put out there. And as consumers, you eventually start believing what the algorithm puts out. And that's also part of how AI hallucinates, but at the same time, the brain fade that it creates on the human mind. Because the more you keep hearing something, the more you start reading about something, your phones are intelligent enough to give you that content repeatedly. And not only you, it also has a digital footprint to understand who your friends are, who your family members are, with whom you've shared that data. And essentially, they fall victim to the same data garbage that you've been consuming, right? Now, this is a slide which I believe for a lot of you might make a lot of sense, because as brands, you got to also understand what are those key levers of distrust. And I'll probably give you about 10 seconds to consume this. And if you look at it, right, these are not rocket science concepts or topics, to be honest. These are things which actually matter. Let's talk about just consumer trust. I mean, this has been there ever since, we've started buying stuff at stores. I mean, you walk into a restaurant, you ask whether the sandwich there is freshly made. That's a trust issue, of course, right? When you go to a car showroom and you say, is this the best discount I get during Diwali? That's a trust issue. So stuff like this is exactly what it is. Consumers haven't changed, brands haven't changed either. The only thing that has actually changed is the way that you consume data, the way you go and sell, and the way you actually are looking at buying from brands, right? So if you look at the second last one, and that's a favorite one of mine, is the limited emotional connect. Because as an AI bot, all you're doing is amplifying, sharing, giving out the content that's been machine led. But at the end of it, where is that human touch point or that emotional angle that you're actually putting? The EQ is almost zero there, right? All hope is not really lost when it comes to AI, because essentially, and everyone really knows that AI is here to stay. It's about how we really adapt as humans to get AI as part of our DNA. And that's where the path forward is, because if you look at it as brand marketeers again, and people who are actually going to be creating this content out there, you got to prioritize authenticity over anything. And when I speak of authenticity, I'm actually speaking of having that human connect, of having the human intervention. You might, I mean, there's no harm in using a lot of chat GPTs and the Groks and the Geminis of the world. That's fantastic. I use it myself. But what's really important is to actually do that 10-minute of proofread, to actually put in your mind into what the platform has thrown up, to put in those bits and elements about practicality and stuff that you've been seeing in your experience of working in organizations and dealing with people, and not just something that has come up. Because if you go and look at it, right now, you saw a number out there which said 74% and 58% and 250 million, etc. What's the source? Just because I'm saying it, is that proof enough? I'm sure it is not. Likewise, do we really question AI and go and check what is the source of the data that Gemini has just thrown up to you? If you go to Gemini today and ask them, what is the revenue forecasted for my brand over the next 3 years, I'm sure it's going to throw up something. I'm sure that's a number your CFO probably doesn't know either, right? So the point is, how do you really quantify, qualify, and actually authenticate the data that AI throws up? Have you really gone and questioned the prompt? Have you gone and said, in fact, I do that a lot, and I hate myself for it sometimes. If the output of the AI platform is not great, I go and say, this is not great. It could actually be much better. And I speak to it almost with a please and thank you, which probably is not really required, because you've got to be really concise in terms of your prompts. But what I'm trying to get here is, you got to question, you got to have the right sort of questioning, the right sort of prompting abilities. And that really comes from our experience and our human minds, right? As brands, there is no real framework today. As a country, India is still, we don't really have an AI framework per se. While Europe has come up with certain regulations, we've got a NIST framework, which has got an AI element to it. But there's not really a standard framework or a check rail or a guardrail when it comes to AI usage as brands. But what we've safely concluded is the starting blocks could be these 4 areas. Essentially, having very transparent disclosures. And that was my disclosure right up front when I said I haven't really used AI as part of my presentation here. So that was a disclosure. Or for that matter, when you are creating brand content on Instagram, you can actually say this is created by AI, or you can have a YouTube video which has actually got a disclosure which says this has been created by AI agents and the data is not authenticated or verified by a human being on the other side. You can also see how this really has cultural nuances to that, because we live in a country which is absolutely very, very cultural sensitive. You saw what happened with was it the Prada or the Gucci, the slippers from Kolhapur, or if you go and see about colors that were used with the iPhone and people associating that with the India Rising promise, etc., etc. So those kind of things are cultural sensitivities that we as brand owners and marketers need to be extremely mindful of. I was talking to somebody who owns a restaurant chain in the UK, and they were speaking about how we've got different segment of burgers here in India where they, even the ones who actually formulated the actual the menu there probably have never been aware of such sort of a diversion from the actual menu when it comes to Indian burgers out there, and that's only because of the cultural nuance, and which is a great thing, to be honest. But at the same time, it can actually spiral out of control and be very, very harmful to your brand if not maintained properly. Now, this is a nice one and maybe worth taking up with you if someone wants to, is actually about how do we really have the trust framework, right? Because if you have these 5 core pillars, essentially talking about your disclosures, the right ethics, having the right sort of verification, being accountable, and at the end of it, having a human touch to whatever you do, I think you're in the right direction when it comes to having the right sort of AI principles, having the right sort of social media content and stuff like that. Now, given we've just got about 3 minutes, I'm going to rush past a couple of things. So if you look at different use cases, right? Localization, authentication, optimization, and obviously audience intelligence is key. But at the same time, you got to be very, very mindful about the misuses of where it can go, right? And that's what I was actually coming to, because if you see what's going to go ahead of time and what's ahead of us at this point in time, brands are going to be only creating stuff with AI. That's a given. Consumers are going to be using AI at their end, but at the same time, as marketers, as social media experts, you've got to be careful about hyper-personalization, having a combination of AR, AI fusion, having the right sort of predictive analytics, and obviously having those combinations of voice, video, and audio plugged in together. And the reason I say voice, video, and audio, because there are 3 different things when it comes to creation. You can actually have someone, you would have seen, I'm not naming politicians here, but if you go to YouTube and you put in your favorite minister's names, you can actually see him being a really good singer on YouTube, whereas he's probably never even sung a song of the same nature, right? So those kind of things are very, very important. At the end of it, given where we are in terms of the roadmap, and I was speaking about a few global trends, we've got a regulatory framework which has emerged. We are looking at hybrid influencer models that are coming up. We're looking at trust verification systems, and hopefully by the end of next year, and while this speaks of 2026 as an outlook, we are very confident that by the end of next year, there would be a slightly more tighter embedded global AI policy which is in place in a lot of countries. At the end, I think the key takeaways for me and for you would probably be AI is here to stay, and it'll always remain as your co-creator and no longer as the independent one. So you've got to be clear in terms of what's your role and where you hand over, but at the same time, the power still remains with you, right? The second one is obviously having a balance between global and local. Just because a platform works really well in the US, really works in Europe, doesn't mean it'll work in India. So you've got to be very careful about adopting stuff that you've been hearing about and others have been using, but being mindful about what really works for you. And the third one is obviously trust is your largest currency when it is, because if brands lose trust, there goes your equity in a minute, and all the brand that you've actually built on will actually be wiped out in minutes, right? And the last line that you see in the red, the future belongs to influencers who use AI to amplify their humanity and not to replace it, because authenticity at scale is the new competitive advantage, right? So I think that's where it was for me as a presentation. We're probably just on time. The only bit that I will actually speak about is going back to the slide, right? And I leave it for you to conclude whether it was used or not. Thank you so much.